Welcome to a special episode of AU Manufacturing Conversations with Brent Balinski, featuring one of the companies we're putting forward as part of our quest to identify and celebrate Australia's 50 most innovative manufacturers for 2024. This campaign has been made possible through the generous support of MYOB, the original business management software developers, nothing beats the OG, as well as the CSIRO, the New South Wales Government's Advanced Manufacturing Research Facility, and the Commonwealth Bank.
Michael, thank you very much for joining us here on AU Manufacturing Conversations. It's good to have you on the program.
Yeah, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
So the first question we ask all guests, and you are no exception, is how did you get here and what do you make?
I've had this question a few times because I've had a rather schizophrenic career when it comes to what I do today in terms of materials and graphene, etc. So I've had the privilege, and I do believe it's a privilege, to work across a lot of different industries. I started out in the electronics and tech space. I then went on to be partners in a software company, and from software I went into shipbuilding. And obviously those are vastly different industries. So, creating software products, a software as a service product, to then sell it to a big American Fortune 250 to go and run shipyards is vastly different. I have that ability to adapt between those industries. So after some time in the shipbuilding industry, I went into defence. So I worked a lot of time in Singapore, and then to the materials technology space. And what drove me into, or I guess attracted me into the role, is having worked in big corporates for quite some time and feeling like a very, very small cog in a massive machine. I wanted a role where I could make a positive impact every day. I need that sense of achievement and driving forward. And also, having experienced high growth industries before, it was quite a nice fit, both in terms of impact, growth potential, and also the fact that it's an ASX-listed company, which brings a new dimension to what you do every day. So that's sort of how I ended up in First Graphene. As a company, we are, I'm going to say, pioneers in the manufacture of graphene, which is an allotrope of carbon. So it's a very, very thin carbon product that is very new to the market. It's been in existence for some 20 years, which sounds like a long time, is not in fact. And we have pioneered the manufacture of it, and now also been driven in to create demand for that product into engineering applications for the use of graphene with our commercial clients.
That's a pretty good recap. And so graphene was a thing that a lot of people were very excited about a decade or so ago, about the time when those two fellows from Manchester won their Nobel Prize, And, around the time and just after it, we're going to put graphene in everything. We're going to have nice bendy screens on our phone as a result of graphene. We're going to have space elevators, yada, yada, yada. Of course, what's possible, in theory, and what's practical are two different things. And we don't yet have graphene in everything. It's in a few bits and pieces, but it hasn't been something that's in widespread adoption yet. Let's sort of refresh the audience's mind as to why it was so exciting. Why is it a remarkable material? Let's hear about some of the wonderful things it can do and might do in future.
When it was first discovered as a material, if you just think of it as a material for a start, it is exceptionally strong. Its strength in terms of the particle is stronger than steel. It conducts electricity better than most materials. It conducts heat. It's abrasion resistance. It's resistant to water. There's so many properties about it that are really interesting when you adapt it into other materials. So, for instance, if you put it into a polymer, you can make that polymer more thermally conductive, or you can make that polymer resistant to abrasion. So I often make the statement that if you're prepared to give the scientific research, trial and validation, if you're prepared to run that course or that program, graphene will make a positive impact into your material, depending on what you're after. But it is a scientifically engineered process to do that. Now, because it's a new industry, and like I said, it's been around for 20 years, but the closest thing you can compare graphene to in terms of the commercialization, the adoption of it, is things like silicon, carbon fiber. These sat on the shelves for years until people figured out how to use them. Now, graphene and the adoption of it is moving faster than both of those products, without a doubt. It'll still take time. So if I use the polymers as an example here, Because it's so new, there is no known way to use it in polymers. There's no one specification off the shelf that you put into polymers and it achieves this. It is still going through that process of working out which product, which type of graphene, how much, how you put it in. All those sort of questions take time. Now, if we look at some of our composite applications, which have now been validated and in production, that took 3 years to prove that scientifically, to convince the clients that was the right thing to do, and for them to get comfortable with it. So it's a very slow process. So 5-10 years ago, the hype of graphene was all there, and it's still got the basis. All those reasons why it was exciting are still there. We're going through that process of trying to commercialize it and find those, what I call killer applications for it. In the last 2 to 3 years, I think we're starting to see those applications, which there'll be a new wave of excitement around that. The demand for it is still growing. So, there's a lot of graphene companies around today that have no revenue at all, that are still working with clients and trying to prove out their IP. First Graphene, on the other hand, we have commercial clients. We're generating revenue now, and we've got a really good growth expectation over the next few years.
There are a few different ways to make graphene. I think the first way that was discovered was Scotch tape, famously, and obviously we've increased in sophistication in the different ways. There's mechanical exfoliation like Scotch tape, but on a different scale, and there are other ways like what Graphene Manufacturing Group is doing, using petrochemicals as a feedstock, I think. What's your method? How are you getting things done, and what's special about your production?
Yeah, so like you say, there is lots of different ways to make graphene, but that also means that graphene is not created equally. So a person, one manufacturer's graphene could vastly differ from how we make it. Now, if you're really crude about it and you take graphite and you smash it up and you smash it to particles that are very, very small, that are thin enough in terms of their carbon layer count to be classified as graphene, you may end up with a, dare I say it, slightly spheronized type of product, more like a ball or a lemon shape. The way we make it, we have pristine platelets, so they're more like a dinner plate shape. And the two materials perform very, very differently. Even though they can both be called graphene, you're talking about a lemon, excuse the pun there, or a lovely pristine plate, dinner plate. Those are sort of the different realms or characteristics of the different types of graphene. So we make a pristine platelet. We use a process called electrochemical exfoliation. Now, we base our process off naturally occurring graphite that comes out of Sri Lanka, and it's regarded as vein graphite, which is very high purity in carbon. So we start with a product that is already 97+% carbon, very few contaminants. And then we use our process to exfoliate, so gently dissolve it and dissolve those platelets off it. And then we size it and dry it and various other processes. But it means that we are letting nature do most of the hard work. The process that we opt for thereafter is high in energy consumption, electricity, but it gives us a very pristine platelet, which are really somewhat unmatched in the industry. We pride ourselves, and it's a continuous flow process, so our specification is quite tightly controlled. Whereas if you're batch manufacturing, different processes result in different specs every time you make it. So we have very tight specification, continuous flow, and we can do that at a really aggressive price as well. Now, if you look at graphene coming out of China, it's the smashed up, mechanically made graphene. Typically, the definition of graphene is questionable there, but you're providing a very, very cheap, just a mechanical smashing process. So you end up with more like a micronized graphite that they're pitching as graphene. Ours, like I said, dinner plate shape at a nano scale, and they perform very, very differently. So how we create our product, the specification of our product, the controllability and the cost of our product gives us a huge advantage. The other thing is that our process is designed for scale. So when people talk about being able to make a ton of graphene and they can scale up to 5 ton, we have our process set today that can make 100 ton per annum. Now there's very few manufacturers in the world that can do that. When you look at some of the applications, you might see people using 50 grams or 100 grams of graphene in their application, which is very, very little. We focus on much larger applications. So most of our purchase orders from our regular clients are somewhere between 5 and 100 kilograms of graphene. So, there is people making some very complicated graphene, very, very high spec, very, very thin, but can only make it in the gram scale. So actually commercializing that is very different outside of a laboratory. So scale, specification, cost all make our process somewhat leading edge.
Understood. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's just a universe of different places you could put graphene and, in theory, improve the way they perform. But I think the first time I heard of First Graphene was to do with boots a few years ago, and I thought, I haven't heard that one. That's novel. I wonder if it'll go anywhere. But nowadays, it looks like the focus for you guys is on cement products. Tell me about why that's a good match for what you can make out of graphene and some of the work that you're doing there.
Yeah, so a bit of history there first. I guess 3 years ago, before I joined First Graphene, there was applications around shoes, footwear, and putting it into the soles of boots. What was misunderstood then is how much graphene is actually required. Now, graphene is not a material which more is better. You've got to find that sweet spot. It is scientifically engineered. So putting it into rubber applications to get wear resistance and adhesion and things like that actually requires very, very little graphene. So for considerable development cost, at the expense of our investor funds, in developing, let's say, a shoe application, which might result in 100 kilos a year, it's very, very low ROI. It's not a great investment. And so when we look at commercial applications, we are looking for volume and margin, obviously. So if we assume that every development to be successful takes X man-years or man-hours, when you look at the return on the investment, you are looking for the biggest volume associated with that. The potential market for graphene in cement and concrete is just massive. There's no other way to put it. There is no other industry that I'm aware of that would require so much graphene. Now, the reason you use graphene in concrete is basically in a laboratory, you can get graphene to make concrete stronger. That is the sort of the baseline of why it's good in that application. The science is strong. You can get 30 to 40% flexural and compressive strength increase in concrete. So with the science there, you then look at how you would use it, how you'd put it into a commercial application, and the game changes quite dramatically. It's very difficult to replicate what you can do in a laboratory at an industrial scale. If you just take, let's say, we're basing a lot of our development in the UK, and the reason why is the UK is geared quite nicely in a commercial sort of calculation to how graphene would benefit it. So when you put it in, you can make the concrete stronger, or you can reduce the amount of clinker or OPC in it, so you make it more environmentally friendly. So our target with the UK is to make the same strength concrete but using less clinker, less CO2 emissions. The UK gets taxed on CO2 emissions. So that model works quite nicely. If we just take that market, it's still such a massive quantity of graphene that they require. So we could just base it on one market segment, even one high-end, high-strength concrete application, and it's still vast demand. So when we look at that and we say, well, we could use 3 or 4 scientists for 3 or 4 years to develop that application to then net 1,000, 2,000 tonne demand for graphene in one client, and you compare that to, let's say, the same amount of investment in a shoe brand, which might result in 1 tonne of demand. So it's just very different. It is a lower margin product line, but the volumes are so vast, the potential volumes are so vast that it's very, very attractive. And the science is there. So when we look at our sort of requirements for pursuing something, we need the science to be there. It needs to actually work and be proven academically, which it does. You need to have a commercially driven client, which we do in the UK, the Breedon Group, very focused on CO2 reduction, increasing their capacity, reducing their tax bill, etc. And then have a product that can support that, and that's what we have been developing in the last 2 years. So cement and concrete, it is our main focus in terms of an application, but be under no illusion, we also work with hundreds of other clients in different applications, all sort of pushing along.
We'd like to take another moment now to acknowledge our sponsors, MYOB, as well as the CSIRO, New South Wales Government's Advanced Manufacturing Research Facility and the Commonwealth Bank. There would be no 50 Most Innovative without these guys. Thanks again for making this campaign possible.
And how far back did you work with Breedon go? And can you tell me something about what you had to do to prove graphene's usefulness, to get it into processes without changing them too much, to basically build up a commercial case for it?
Yeah, so a bit of background for listeners. The Breedon Group is essentially UK's largest producer of cement. Now, we've kept the story, our investors updated over the last few years, but I think the understanding how large or how significant Breedon is as per an operator, it is somewhat of an unknown to our Australian-based investors. So we need to be clear, Breedon is the largest producer of cement in the UK. The UK market alone for us, if we were successful, could generate thousands of tonnes of graphene demand. Our relationship with them dates back a couple of years, and it came about by essentially Innovate UK grant funding to explore the idea of green cement being a lower CO2 emissions product. And through a collaboration with ourselves, with Breedon, and also Manchester University and Morgan Sindall, which is an infrastructure company in the UK, we started a relationship to explore green cement funded by the UK government. And that has built a really positive relationship with those entities. Breedon has continued to grow their cement demand. Morgan Sindall is heavily involved in UK national highways projects or infrastructure projects. So as a pairing of potential clients, that is a fabulous set of people. So we've been really excited by that. Now, what Breedon brought to the table is they bring access to essentially the largest cement plant in all of the UK. Now, like I said before, getting a result with cement or getting graphene into cement and into concrete in a laboratory is easy. It's when you take it to scale. Now, the plant that we have access to in the UK, like I said, the largest one in the UK, Breedon were happy for us to figure out how we would add graphene into that process. Now, that's not something every graphene company has the opportunity to do, but it also brings about a huge amount of challenges. So how do we get graphene into the final milling stage of the production of cement? How do we avoid putting too much water into it? How do we deal with it? How do we ensure that it disperses correctly? And also the scale of it. So when you, let's say, test graphene in a polymer, you might use 50 grams of product for a trial. This trial included 1.2 tonnes of graphene. So the scale is just so much larger. So the risk is higher as well. So we had the opportunity in Breedon, we're happy to do that. We have now run 2 trials through the Breedon plant. The first one netted a positive result that says we can essentially get a CEM2 product, which is a lower clinker factor cement, to within tolerance of the tier 1 cement manufacturer in terms of strength. So that was a real success. The second trial was more about the dosing mechanism. How do we dose it? So, we essentially have a powder product, which we can have like a paste, but getting that into a dry powdered process can be quite complicated. So the second trial really sort of worked out the dosing mechanism. There was a few different variations of that. So in terms of a strength measurement, that's not something we really took from that. It's how well we dispersed it into the cement. And now we're sort of gearing up for a third trial, which has a customized product specification. So we've found that a certain platelet size, graphene platelet size, works best. And we've also revised our dosing mechanism as well. So essentially what we are gearing up to trial is our go-to-market solution for the cement and concrete space. Also, as part of our work with Breedon, we have signed an exclusive development and commercialisation agreement with them, which says we will work together to target the UK market to get graphene-enhanced cement with the UK's largest cement producer. So that in itself is pretty exciting for us.
You're all the way in Perth or thereabouts. The UK is a fair way from that. I'm not an expert in geography, but I'm pretty sure of that much. You're making huge amounts of graphene. I'm guessing that you're probably not going to make it in Perth, ship it to the UK. And tell us a little more about how this relationship will work commercially. Are you going to be, licensing IP for someone else to make graphene in the UK, or are you going to be making it there or making it here and shipping it? I imagine not. But yeah, I'd like to know how that works.
Yeah, so this is pure blue sky talking here. Graphene itself, the way we produce it, our highest dollar value or dollar cost on our bill of materials is energy. If we take the cement segment, for example, we're creating a product that uses very small amounts, that produces a large amount of cement to target the reduction of CO2 emissions. So how we get our energy, what sort of energy we get, is also a factor. Our plant is in Western Australia at the moment, and for no other reason other than where my predecessor lived and the sort of team was formed, that is why we have a plant in Western Australia. As you may know, energy is quite expensive in Western Australia on a sort of global scale. It doesn't come from clean sources yet, but those are pretty significant factors for the cost of our product and also the intent of getting it into sort of green space. And as you put it, it's essentially an opposite side of the world to where the bulk of our demand is. Now, we have significant clients in Western Australia here, which is fantastic. But the adoption of new materials, the potential demand is not in Australia. It's mainly in Europe and the UK, a little bit in the States. So those are the sort of markets it's going to. So you're right, shipping it around the world could become costly. And it's a strange product to ship. So if you think of a kilo bag or a 500-gram bag of graphene is quite large because its surface area is so high, it's very fluffy, it's very light, so it takes up a lot of volume. If it's in a predispersed aqua or a paste, it's 80% water, so you're shipping water around the world. So it doesn't sort of, it's either heavy or very voluminous, so it's a bit difficult. If we were to find that we had very, very large demand, let's say in the UK, for instance, and this is just purely blue sky talking here, there is a certain argument that says, well, the UK has large sources of renewable energy. Wind energy is fairly easy to come by. It's DC, which suits our process. Our process itself is highly automated, so it's not contingent on low labour costs. That's not really a factor for us. It's energy. So there is a certain argument that says if the demand is in Europe or the UK, that we put a plant there so we avoid that shipping of a strange material. Who knows, really? It's more of a case of, where does our volume demand come from first, and then we can figure the back end out later. I do believe there is always going to be a place for our plant in Western Australia. 100 tonne is a significant volume of graphene. It's our history, and I think in terms of domestic manufacturing, it's brilliant for that. So it's probably more along the lines of a higher margin type product for certain applications versus the likes of cement and concrete.
As we said earlier, there's a wealth of applications for graphene, and we've focused on cement and related products here, but you could do a lot else, and you are looking to do some other things. Tell me, please, about something very different, the work on perovskite solar cells.
Yeah, so one point I sort of haven't mentioned is, we put a lot of time, resources into the cement and concrete segment. The applications outside of that is just so broad. It sort of naturally de-risks your business by having such a diverse number of industries that we can make a positive impact on. The work with perovskite solar cells comes to a electrically and thermally conductive coating. So perovskite solar cells are typically lower cost, and the idea to get them manufactured on a reel-to-reel basis, so you're essentially printing a solar cell with various other materials and bits and pieces, graphene being one layer in a multi-layer solution. We can provide that sort of electrical conductivity and thermal conductivity that removes the historic need for a gold layer in some of the perovskite cells. So by removing gold out of those, you take about 80% of the cost of manufacturing those cells out of it. So graphene does perform better in that application in terms of an ink. It takes out a huge amount of raw materials costs, and it can be made as a reel-to-reel process, so you can spray it on as a coating. So that's been interesting. We've been partnered with Halocell or Halocell across in New South Wales, and they've been working to develop these cells for use in two applications that we've discussed publicly before. One is the small cells that you see on price labels in supermarkets. So this is a digital label that tells you the price of a product. It takes ambient light from your fluorescent tubes and then generates enough electricity out of that to keep that display up. The other one is recharging remote control batteries. So those two applications are the ones that they're trying to tackle first, and then they'll expand and get larger, etc. And they're also working on a space variant of that, satellite variant of that as well. So there's three exciting ones. The two consumer-based ones being the price tags, the remote controls, etc., where volume comes from, and those would be pretty exciting applications. When we talk about different applications, that's one. You've got to remember, when you sort of take a snapshot of the customers we have today, we have customers buying it to put it in swimming pools, to make swimming pools stronger, lighter, longer life cycle. We have the cement and concrete people using it in active products. We have lubricants, so people using it in lubricants for bearings. We have, obviously, our rubber products, which are things like wear liners and footwear. We also have it in coatings now, which is like elastomeric waterproofing and coatings. The list just expands on, and lots of those, I'd love to be able to talk about the names of those companies, which we can't under NDA, but we are seeing that adoption of the material accelerating. If we look at last month's purchase orders, although we had a few significant ones, the bulk of them are just reoccurring now. So instead of getting one order for 50 grams to sell it as a trial, they're now at that sort of 5 kilogram, and it's the third time they've done it now, and the next one is 20 kilograms and the next is 100. So that trend is what sort of gets me a bit more excited about it, is because that organic efforts that we've put in, that organic growth is starting to build now.
Well, you've obviously got a wealth of different R&D projects underway, and we don't have time to talk about all of them, but we do have time to, and I'd really like to talk about your personal definition of innovation, perhaps philosophically, what guides that R&D work and how you see it as a value. How do you understand innovation? We're talking because of the 50 Most Innovative campaign, which you guys are part of. We'd really like to get your definition of that word, please.
Yeah, it's a good question. I know. Well, I've been through enough development in some really exciting spaces over the years. The company I worked for many years ago was on the start of GPS navigation for consumer products, so transferable consumer navigation products, and then the introduction of things like Bluetooth and cellular telemetry products and stuff like that. I think the one thing that innovation needs to be defined of is creating something meaningful. It's great, you could put it down to ideas and evolving ideas and all those sorts of things, but it's got to translate into something meaningful for me to consider as being innovative. A lot of people sit around and dream stuff up that are meaningless. There is no point to them, or they have no sensible use case. I pride myself in having a real commercial focus in how I run First Graphene. So developing and researching stuff through universities is all well and good, but it's got to have a commercial outcome. It's got to be meaningful. Not necessarily as a CEO, it needs to make money for us, but in terms of a definition of innovation, it needs to be meaningful. It needs to offer something to the human race that is positive or makes life easier or actually has a worth. We were involved in a company some time ago that the idea of using this technology to unboil an egg was something interesting. Now, I find that as a completely meaningless process and waste of time. Why would you want to do that? And so unless somebody can tell me how this has meaning, how this has worth, then it's difficult for me to peg the word this is an innovative idea. Does that make sense?
It does. It's weird that you mentioned unboiling an egg, because I was looking at some lab at Flinders University, and among other applications for this technology they were making, I can't remember what it was. Name is escaping me, but unboiling an egg was among them. And I don't think I've heard of unboiling an egg mentioned more than twice in my life. And I think that both of those occasions were today. So that's quirky that should come up. So lastly, let's continue with stuff with meaning attached to it. I'd love to get your perspective on the standard closing question for our series. And that's, what's an issue within manufacturing that isn't getting the attention it's
Are you referring to manufacturing in Australia specifically?
Let's go with that.
So I spent the early part of my career basically taking electronic products, so GPS navigation products, and transferring that from New Zealand to China, Indonesia, Singapore, basically offshore manufacturing. And I drove that for many years. That was, my early stage career. That is what I did. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I could see the cost benefit to the company, absolutely. But what I never really sort of paid attention to is the negative effect it has on a country or a domestic economy. And I can understand how companies would go, it's cheaper to make it offshore. We get better returns for our investors or our owners. Let's just go and do it. But it does have a point that it starts to break down and become a real negative in terms of the domestic economy. I think one of the things I'd like to see focused on in years to come is governments, the Australian government or just governments in general, trying to incentivise companies to keep manufacturing at home. You look at Australia, it's now lost pretty much all of the automotive manufacturing industry. That's sad, considering you've got a population of somewhere between, 25 to 30 million people, somewhere in that range, that can't justify it commercially to have their own automotive industry. I think it's a negative. You end up with a country that is very limited on, sustaining its own economy, that is reliant on every other country in the world to exist. And now, as a CEO, I look upon those things a lot differently than just straight dollar value. So I think that is something that is lacking from the Australian manufacturing industry, is try and keep it at home. There's something to be said about that. If you take the likes of, and again, this is just me sort of rambling a bit, but if you take the likes of Apple, so, Apple has most of its manufacturing in China and now extending into India, etc. The US is the poorer for that. They are. The US used to be one of the manufacturing giants of the world, and they are not anymore. They've significantly lost a lot of that power and a lot of that talent to do that. And it's to their detriment. The way taxation rules and things like that around the world, the US is the poorer for that now. So I think there definitely needs to be some kind of focus on that. The other one is, and this is more specific to Western Australia, obviously Western Australia, very, very focused in terms of GDP on mining, and rightly so. It's got some fantastic assets to sort of build on, but it's now so dependent on that. You've lost throughout all manufacturing through trades, etc. You've lost all of the talent that typically created that industry, sustained it, built it. We've lost that to go and work in mines. Now, mining is cyclic, we all know that. So there's up times and there's down times, and it makes perfect sense in terms of the estate revenue, etc. But it's also to the detriment of the tradies, the manufacturing capability. That's also lost, and that's disappointing as well, among frustrating as well.
Another thing you're throwing away is the capacity to add more value. I mean, I don't see it as a mining versus manufacturing thing. I'm not here to bash mining, but if you don't have, a secondary industry as well, you see what happens with iron ore. And I heard a little while ago that there's a company called Green Steel of WA, and one of their key messages is we don't make steel in Western Australia. So there's a huge gap between getting stuff out. Companies do incredibly well, the best in the world, and then they ship the ore, and then the ore comes back here with value added to it that we could be creating at home alongside many, many jobs and all the other benefits.
It's an interesting one. One of the best examples I ever heard was, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it was something like this, was about baby formula going into China. The New Zealand milk producer, Fonterra, they would generate milk solids and they would sell it into an entity in Singapore that would then refine it into the powders that would then go into China. And the margin cut on this was something like Fonterra was about 5%, and then what the company in Singapore would get was about 85%, and then sold into China. It was just obscene that you've got the fundamental ingredient of something, but you're taking such a small amount of value add. Yeah, it's crazy. And you're right, that's exactly the way in Australia. It's great to see, there's a lot of different opinions on this, but I think it's a great thing to see that the Australian government want to build submarines here. I do. I think it's a fantastic and exciting opportunity if it's done right. It brings huge amounts of jobs into country, and it brings a huge amount of skill set as well, which is exciting.
Certainly. If you will not dwell on this too much longer, because I'm aware you have a business to run and presumably a family and other things in the background as well. But when you were talking about sending manufacturing overseas, I was thinking that you lose that and it's self-perpetuating. If you say, okay, well, this thing, we're going to do it in the interests of shareholders in a low labour cost country. That potential is lost elsewhere. Meanwhile, you lose that economic complexity, I think they call it, that development of industry and lots of different skill sets. That all goes somewhere else. And the next time an opportunity comes up, it's not going to be something that can be realised here because you've already dealt yourself out of that and you don't have the skill sets that are required to bring something from a university idea, say, or some guy's bright idea in his backyard shed through to the very grueling last stage of commercialisation and the product on a shelf. You do that and it becomes easy to do and it becomes self-perpetuating, I believe.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, Michael, I've rambled more than enough and you've provided some very good answers and some very good things for me to think about. And thanks again for being on AU Manufacturing Conversations. Great to meet you and great to have you on the program.
Yeah, great to chat. Thank you so much. It's appreciated.